A pleasure to meet all at last, and today we are at our next installment for HJN. But most importantly is that we have ourselves more franchises to talk about. But not to worry, because I only have a few more left to do so. In this instance, what we got here is something that's been going on for a pretty long time, like most of the others, but it actually does precede most of the others thus far, Dracula. So, we might as well talk a bit about that. And if you're wondering about most of the other classic monster series, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Invisible Man, and many of the others, well, I feel like those might be better saved for another time. Because here, I just feel like talking about one of the bunch. In the case of Dracula, whom is arguably seen as one of the more popular ends of the classic Monsterverse series, or as seen in the classic Universal monster films. The thing is, though, is that Dracula is quite honestly one of the most numerous when it comes to film appearances. In fact, you could say that over 270 movies have been put together with the unique titular vampire that, of course, wasn't entirely responsible for starting up the mass vampire myth, or of course, pre-generating the unique concept, a bloodthirsty, unholy creature that is bound to create all sorts of chaos with unique powers and such. The thing is, though, is that most people might talk about the ups or the downs of the vampire itself. Not just Dracula, but vampirism in general. First off, the notions of such things like holy water, or water as a whole, as it turns out, holy devices including the hawthorn tree, a crucifix, or essentially anything that resembles a cross as a whole, such things like garlic, parmesan, cheese, wolfsbane flowers, which are meant for the werewolves, by the way, and then of course such other classic things like sunlight and a stake through the heart. These are, of course, just believe it or not, only a handful of the hundreds of possible ways that vampires can be killed. In the case of Dracula, though, despite being known as one of the most popular in terms of vampires, he's certainly not the only type that has been seen as powerful or as well represented in pop culture. I mean, you could say that Sesame Street, for instance, did a good job at parodying Dracula by taking one of the known examples of a vampire's weakness, which of course is counting. Yeah. The thing is, Sesame Street's The Count does a good job at counting for the kids. But some people don't quite realize the fact that there was, in fact, a foretold written weakness about the vampire in general that forces them to sit on the floor and count individual grains or individual objects that are spilled in front of them by local villagers. I couldn't make any of this stuff up if I tried. But as gnarly and humiliating as that sounds, there's a lot more to Dracula here that I can talk about. First off, one of the first iterations of Dracula is, of course, the novel. Some might think of it with Bram Stoker, some might think of it with Mary Shelley, whom is also responsible for Frankenstein, and some might think of it with various other authors of the 19th and 20th centuries. But in terms of film, he has been put to film a lot over the years. At first in the form of Count Orlok in the famous German silent film called Nosferatu in 1922. We of course had gotten a remake in 2024, which of course was put out by Robert Egger, a man who was incredible over the years for making a lot of historically accurate pieces unlike any other. I mean, The Witch, The Lighthouse, just to name a few. But Nosferatu, I feel like he's really upped his game to the point where it really makes you feel like that you're actually in the 19th century, a certain part of the Victorian era, that of which allows for us to truly delve into what the culture is like, and moreover, how terrifying it must have been to live in that sort of life. A life of such things like ignorance, superstition, and a bit of naivety because of the fact that there was not such things like internet and smartphones, which allowed for our own brains to keep a hold of a lot of information and knowledge about certain things. We were always kept up to date with certain things. In the same regard as to how some people might keep themselves up to date with things that were written on newspapers, for instance. Those, of course, were around at the time, but not everybody got a hold of them to read. And especially if they did so, they would only focus on maybe a couple of things since they would only have so much time before needing to go to work. Yeah, so apart from everything I've discussed here, there's a lot more to Dracula and all that stuff. Of course, we can't forget most other films that were put together just as well. There was the iconic Universal film series, which at first was famous for starring Bela Lugosi, a Hungarian man who became iconic with the role itself, and not only appeared in Dracula in the official Universal monster films, but also as guest star appearances, including a collaboration with Betty Boop herself. No joke. Other iterations, of course, include the likes of the Hammer's horror series, which starred Christopher Lee, and there was also the Munsters and the Addams Family, whom had a vampiric member of the family just as well. You also had iterations on Scooby-Doo, Tom and Jerry, and various other cartoons throughout the 80s and 90s, and even well into the new millennium as well. You, of course, even have the Hotel Transylvania series starring Adam Sandler. These films, of course, were unique for bringing a new generation of the classic monsters to life in ways that today's kids can truly understand. And I myself do enjoy these films. I, of course, didn't see the first two, haven't seen much of the third, and I'm sure there's probably more down the line at some point later on. But nevertheless, though, with all that I've said so far about Dracula, and I'm sure there's probably going to be more down the line for me as well, I just can't see that happening anytime soon. Other than all that, though, it's just a big series. A series that spanned for a few centuries, and possibly even more so, mostly because of the old folklores and tales and legends that spanned possibly many years before. In fact, it might even go well into the BC era in humanity's lifetime. But I guess history is just history. And while there's a lot more of that I can touch here, I'm mostly focusing on the media aspects of Dracula and the kind of impact that he had on society. Despite being seen as a fictional character, he of course has some representation of real-life anomalies. We do have actual bloodsuckers that are known to be true terrifying killers in nature. Mosquitoes, lamprey, and there were even talks about the so-called vampire monkey. But that's a totally different story that we'll save for another video. So with all that being said, thank you very much for enjoying this piece, and of course, I will have 2 more down the line as well. So make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more content.